Good morning, friends. Today we come to the second part of our lecture on the evolution of cultural policy. Um, in the last class, we discussed about the significance of the local and the regional in cultural policy making and how that has gradually become more and more important. And the significance of the local and the regional has gradually shifted to the center of cultural policy and associated research. But this has not happened overnight. This has taken a lot of time, and this is actually taken a lot of time for the local and the regional to be recognized. And based on whatever discussions we have had so far, I think you can understand why and how the local and the regional was becoming more and more important in cultural policy. Now, but when we say this, it doesn't mean that the local was completely absent in cultural activities. In fact, to be fair, the local was always present in all kinds of cultural activities. And culture has always been about the activities of people and groupings at the local level. Thus, in material concrete terms, culture has always existed at the level of the local. When you talk about culture, lived culture, where does culture exist? Culture exists amongst people. Amongst people where? At the local, at the regional level. So it is we who, at a later stage, formed these theoretical abstractions about culture. You know, uh, talking in terms of universal culture, completely ignoring the specificity of local cultural experiences. So that is very important for us to understand. The local cultural specificities actually constitute the core of culture, right? It, culture doesn't exist universally except as an abstraction. And where does this abstraction come from? What does this abstraction rely on? It relies on the perceived value of cultural items. So, for instance, some kind of cultural items are considered to be more important than some others. Some cultural items are considered to be more valuable than some others. But this is an abstraction, nevertheless, right? But in the process, the local, the regional, and the lived realities of life completely disappear from the scene. However, as we discussed in the last lecture, the localized culture was something that was felt to be important when culture came to be used for the growth of or for the shaping of nationalism. So that is when localized culture was called back to service, was pressed into service of nation building. And in the process, cultural products came to be seen as the commodities of the nation. So, what engaged the attention of the cultural policymakers at this stage was the understanding of culture as commodity. This is how they thought of culture. That culture was a commodity and it had value. And but in doing this, the local cultures, particularly the less privileged ones, which did not have access to uh, positions of power or positions of visibility, whereby they could sell themselves better, those cultures remained relegated to the background. However, gradually there was a new trend that arose among the cultural policy makers, which began to take cognizance of the cultural turn in the humanities and social sciences. This new trend was called democratization of culture philosophy or the democratization of culture trend. This is very, very important in the history of the evolution of cultural policy. And because this was a moment when it is realized that the local cultures or the regional varieties of culture could not be kept out of discussions anymore. Culture, if it had to survive, I mean, if cultural policy had to work, it had to take into account local cultures. It had to be more inclusive. So there was this new philosophy, this new trend of democratization of culture. Please remember the the term democratization of culture. So, according to this trend, cultural policy should pay attention to the availability of culture and cultural services from all social groups. So, the focus was particularly on social groups that way from the margins or that way from the periphery, right? So, the whole idea, the whole philosophy was to be more and more inclusive, to include more and more communities within the framework of cultural policy. However, this trend of democratization of culture, though it sounds very good, it had its own limitations. So, democratization of culture therefore had to make way at a later stage to an even more liberal and an even more accommodative approach towards cultural policy making. And this new approach was called cultural democracy. So remember, first there was the recognition of the local culture, the regional cultural practices. This gradually led to the evolution of the trend of democratization of culture. But at one point of time, it was realized that even democratization of culture was not as inclusive as we thought it was. And therefore, there was a move towards this new approach called cultural democracy. And the main contention of this new approach was that politics should be formulated in relation to the cultural needs of people in their everyday lives. It is important for policymakers to take into account what people thought about culture. Instead of looking at culture from the outside, we should look at it from the perspective of the people. What do the people themselves think of culture? So let's not have a top-down approach. Instead, let's try think up a bottom-up approach. What counted as culture can only be decided by people themselves. So what happened very often earlier was that external standards of aesthetic merit, they were used to measure what counted as culture and what would not count as culture, because there was this idea of culture as refinement. Remember, we had a discussion on this earlier, that culture was something that some people had and some people did not have. But there, cultural democracy basically calls out for a even far more inclusive approach that accepts that every, all aspects of life, all ways of life of all communities is culture, and these external standards of aesthetic merit should not be used to measure what counted as culture. So this is a very, very important development. Democratization of culture was inclusive, but still it had its limitation. And one of its biggest limitation was that somewhere along the line it was still applying the external standards of aesthetic merit to judge whether the practices of a particular community would count as culture or not. But cultural democracy completely tries to do away with this external standards of aesthetic merit. If the people think of something, some aspect of their everyday material lived lives as culture, then it was culture, plain and simple. This new approach was called cultural democracy, and as I said, and it was therefore a lot more accommodative and a lot more inclusive than the trend of democratization of culture, right? So I have just pointed out that one limitation of the trend of democratization of culture. Uh, we cannot say for sure that cultural democracy is the final phase. Maybe something better will come at a later stage, which will be even more accommodative and even more inclusive than cultural democracy. But this is where we stand right now. We think cultural democracy is quite good. In fact, it's better than most of the other approaches towards cultural policy making that we have used in the past. And that's where, it has found a place. But 10 years from now, 2 decades from now, maybe even that will become redundant and we will be more conscious of its limitation. But as of now, cultural democracy is the thing. And there's another problem with the trend of democratization of culture that I'd like to point to because that's very important for cultural policymakers to take into account. It had, the trend of democratization of culture, it had the imprint of the project of colonialism. You can still see the colonial hangover in the trend called democratization of culture. The limitation of this approach was that it pitted particular forms of culture against the others. So one set of culture was considered to be good and the other was considered to be bad. So it was very value judgmental about culture. This was another limitation. Thus, it had the potential to create an environment in which the state aligned itself with a preferred variety of culture, right, that fitted its ideology or that fitted its scheme of things, and thereby it also could marginalize potentially other cultures. Thus, for instance, cultural minorities, for instance, could face systematic discrimination against their cultures and against their values because there's a question of either or. I mean, you side with particular kinds of cultural forms as being more appropriate than the others, which is the typical way of working of the colonial masters. And there's a serious limitation, as you can see, with this. So that is another limitation of the approach called democratization of culture. So the real concern, the really important thing for cultural policy is to move from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach, as I said. And that is what cultural democracy tries to be. This is the need of the moment. So instead of the government or the bureaucracy telling people about what is best for them, cultural policy should evolve at the grassroots and then make its way up the ladder, we call it ladder or whatever, then make its way to the policymakers. It should not be um, an imposition from above. Let the people decide what they think of as culture and how they visualize the growth or the preservation and all these issues of culture. However, this is easier said than done. For here we are faced with the next problem. Uh, who will represent the people? This is one of the most important questions that remains unanswered, I'm afraid, in the field of cultural policy. Who will take the decision? And these are extremely important questions, as I said, in cultural policy, and they reflect the ways in which people think about culture in a given society. And it is in this context that one also has to look at the market as a huge influence in shaping cultural policy, right? So the question of representation remains a key question in the field of cultural policy, and I'm afraid that's a question that has not yet been answered satisfactorily. Who will represent whom, and who will take the decisions on behalf of a community? So this remains an issue of contention. And when we talk about the evolution of cultural policy, we have talked about it historically so far. Mm, you see, we have looked at the gradual progression of cultural policy over the years, and we have arrived today at a stage of cultural democracy and all that. But it's also very important for us to realize that cultural policy today cannot be formulated without thinking about global consequences. So there's a need to make people aware about the implications of cultural policy at a global level. So the question of the internationalization of cultural policy becomes extremely important. This is where the UNESCO has played an extremely important role, right? And in the internationalization of cultural policy. Uh, Let me now, just talk about the internationalization of cultural policy. And actually, just as the clamor for localization was growing in cultural policy, there was also a simultaneous need being felt to understand the global implications of cultural policy. Because why has this become important? This has become important because today we don't any longer live in closed doors. We are not islands. We are all impacted by what happens in other societies. So, this understanding is very, very important for cultural policy to evolve. That you cannot do anything in a place, in a particular locality, in a particular region, without having an impact on people living in other parts of the world. This one of the very simple reasons behind this is the fact that in this global uh, society that we're living in the kind of society where people are living and moving at a faster pace from one part of the world to the other, migrating from one part of the world to the other, our lives and our destinies have come to be very, very closely connected. So you simply cannot ignore the question of internationalization or the importance of thinking internationally when we are talking about cultural policy. Just to give you an example, say heritage, for instance, is local at one level, but it is also universal at the same time, right? So how can you take a decision about heritage which is merely, limited to the local? Say, for instance, the great heritage sites of the world. And this is how the thinking goes. I mean, these are not the exclusive property of one community alone. Of course, the community living there should have the preference in deciding what happens to it. But then it's not something that's limited to one community alone. It's a heritage of the world. It is a heritage that belongs to the people of the entire world. Just think about the worldwide content for the Bamiyan statues in Afghanistan. At one level, of course, these statues belong to the Afghans and the Afghans alone, and they're free to decide what happens to it. But at the same time, they're also part of the universal heritage of mankind. So, basically, the same logic applies to all forms of heritage and all forms of culture. This is where the UNESCO has played a very important role in the internationalization of cultural policy. Thus, in many of its conferences that were organized since the late 1960s onwards, you see that the UNESCO began to take an explicitly post-colonial stand on culture, right? Critiquing the flaws, the inherent flaws in colonialism. That was what the UNESCO tried to do. And in other words, UNESCO put forward the argument that culture is one of the most important components of human resources of developing countries, and therefore it had to be protected and preserved and um, um, some, allowed to continue for the next generation. Thus, there was a need to internationally recognize the cultural rights of the people of the developing countries. And UNESCO's emphasis on cultural rights and diversity increased over the years. And finally, in 1995, as we are all aware, I'm sure that you are all going to remember that year, 1995, was when the UNESCO launched the World Decade for Cultural Development. And they published a report which was titled Our Creative Diversity, right? This report was extremely important in the history of the evolution of cultural policy. Remember the title of the report, it's called Our Creative Diversity, and it reflected the growing concern of the UNESCO for cultural rights and diversity, particularly of the people uh, of the developing countries. I just want to you to listen to a bit of history about this. Boutros Ghali was the then Secretary General of the United Nations, and Federico Mayer was the Director General of UNESCO, and they jointly created the World Commission on Culture and Development in 1992. And this was a very, very important development. Think about it. World Commission on Culture and Development. So people were beginning to see the connection between culture and development. Earlier, economics was the only thing that apparently development had to do with. But now, um, culture had become very, very important in terms of development. And the objective of this commission was to rethink the concept of development, to give a new definition of the concept of development, because they were basically taking cognizance of a new and broad concept of development that was beginning to evolve in the social sciences and the humanities. And of course, we are all well aware of this, that there is this need to critique, this perceived need to critique this idea that development was only about economics. Development was not anymore only about economics, it is realized. And one of the thinkers who coincidentally is from India, who was responsible for shaping these new thoughts on development was Amartya Sen. For instance, he promoted the idea of development as a process of um, as a process to boost people's capacities and broaden their options. Development was not just about economic development, it is also about increasing the opportunities for people. It is also about boosting the capacities of people. It is also about broadening their options. Thus, it gradually came to be realized that uh, culture, as well as cultural diversity and freedom, uh, they were imperative for the full development of people and communities. So this was a very, very important thing that happened, which had a deep impact on even the UNESCO, I believe, and in fact, throughout all the disciplines of social sciences and humanities were impacted by this new understanding of development, that it had to take cognizance of culture, that it had to take cognizance of cultural diversity, that it had to take cognizance of the question of freedom of individuals to pursue the life that they want, to increase the choices for the individual. That is real development. A truly developed society is one in which the individual has many choices, right? He has the freedom to choose, and those choices are not limited, because if you give people the freedom to choose without really increasing the choices for them, it doesn't make any sense. But a truly developed society is one which should you know give space to culture, give space to cultural diversity, and also give individuals the freedom um, to think beyond um, you know the limited choices that are generally made available for citizens living in a developing country. And UNESCO's report, which is titled The Creative Diversity, it presented a relook at this, as I said, this whole idea of development. And it included a range of new issues within development, such as the question of the rights of women and children, the recognition of indigenous peoples, and the preservation of the world's cultural heritage. All these things became important. And the report also presented a bold new vision of global development that paid attention to the needs of all cultural groups. Interestingly, the report also quoted from Claude Lévi-Strauss's vision of world civilization as a worldwide coalition of cultures, each of which would preserve its own originality. That is the idea, almost like the idea of the salad bowl of multiculturalism. That was behind the framing of this report called Our Creative Diversity. Right? And this vision, of course, may seem too idealistic and too optimistic when we think about the situation that we are faced with presently. When we think about the manifold difficulties that lie uh, ahead of us, when we think about the lack of tolerance, the lack of mutual respect for other people's cultures in the world today. But having said this, this is an idealism that is worth striving for. It may be idealistic, may be too optimistic, the report, but still, I think there is a case for uh, to strive for an idealism of this kind, to realize this idealism, to make it come true. But this report of UNESCO has also received a lot of flack over the years since its publication. And critics of globalization, particularly, are deeply suspicious, very, very suspicious of this model of or this vision of one world. What do you mean by this one world? Whose world is it going to be? Because actually, in reality, there is, of course, the danger that this one world will be dominated by one class of people, one group of people, and the others will be left out. So of course, the report does try to counter the threat for it, because it argues that any convincing vision of a global society must today accommodate cultural diversity. But there is, I believe, a deeper problem, a deeper malady, a deeper issue that it fails to resolve completely. And this is where I want you to pay very careful attention. See, this is a theme that we will keep coming, keep cropping up in the course of our lectures. Um, Defending cultural diversity might actually prevent organizations like the UNESCO, say for instance, from condemning oppressive practices like female genital mutilation or female infanticide. All right. It's so important for us to show that we are appreciative of cultural diversity, which is a wonderful thing, and that is how it should be. At the same time, there is the danger that this acceptance of cultural diversity, accommodating cultural diversity, should not paralyze us when it comes to taking a stand about issues such as uh, female genital mutilation or female infanticide. Should we just allow it to continue in the name of culture, or should we take a definite stand about it? You know, just for the sake of being politically correct, should we stop being value judgmental even about things like these, or shall we put a stop here and say that this doesn't work, this doesn't have any acceptance, this cannot be accepted in times that we're living in today. The report very carefully, it says that we need to understand these practices in depth, that is in the context. But still, having said that, um, can you defend practice like female genital mutilation or practice like female infanticide? however much you may contextualize it, however much you may historicize it, the fact of the matter is it's a practice that's condemnable. I mean, political correctness should not prevent us from taking a stand on these issues. This is where I think the report gets into a bit of a problem. But otherwise, the intention is right, and the idea of um, being more inclusive in terms of cultural diversity, of course, is a welcome thing. And there are, of course, many other progressive things in the report as well. And in more recent times, cultural policy has tended to move beyond obsession with geographic boundaries, whether we like it or not. Today, cultural policy must rethink the connection between culture and place. Stuart Hall, it was, who pointed out, many years, quite a few years back now, that this uh, irreversible blurring of the relationship between culture and place has already come about in the world today due to migration of communities, the smooth and incessant flow of information, and the collapse of time-space divides. Thus, we are living in a world where local, regional, national, and global practices and discourses of cultural policy influence and shape each other. So culture can no longer be tied down to a single place alone because community members are traveling across the world. So you cannot just confine culture to a place now, to a geographic location only anymore. People are constantly on the move and they spread out all over the world. So it would seem ridiculous today to tie down culture to a single place alone. Just to give you an example, and I'll conclude our lecture today with this. Many years back, I was walking around in the streets of Toronto. I came across many departmental stores, Indian departmental stores, or subcontinental departmental stores, which were selling Hilsa fish that had just been flown in from West Bengal or from Bangladesh. So this is the new world that we're talking about. So we're living, as I said, I repeat, we're living in a world where local, regional, national, and global practices and discourses of cultural policy, they influence and negotiate and shape each other's policies on a daily basis. Thank you so much.